Awesome. Hello, everyone. I will get us started as people start joining in. But yeah, thank you everyone for taking the time out to join us this afternoon for this webinar. It's so wonderful and lovely to have you with us. For those of us who haven't met yet, my name is Jessica Ngwenya. I am part of the COPAC team and the Climate Justice Charter Movement. And yeah, it's a privilege alongside the team to be able to host and moderate this discussion today. This is the first in a series of webinars we'll host as part of our Eco-Mobility and Clean Energy Public Transport campaign. For those of you who aren't familiar with the CJCM, on the 29th of October 2019, the Climate Justice Charter was launched at a mass assembly, and the charter emerges out of 6 years of campaigning during the worst drought in South Africa's history. And at the heart of the charter is a bold vision for systemic change. It's been informed by grassroots input from water-stressed community, the media, labor, faith-based communities, youth, climate scientists, academics, women's organizations, environmental and social justice organizations, as well as leading activists. The Charter seeks to realize climate justice now through accelerating the deep, just transition from below. This arises obviously out of the awareness that more climate shocks and ecological crisis will result in more suffering for the majority, particularly workers, the poor, people with disabilities, landless, and the vulnerable. And so, in light of this, the Charter puts forward 14 systemic alternatives to accelerate a deep, just transition. These are people's alternatives which can meet our basic needs, enhance our capacity to deal with climate disasters, and to prepare us to regenerate life supporting systems. These alternatives include feeding ourselves through food sovereignty, democratizing the water commons, zero waste and simple living. And today we will be focusing on eco-mobility and clean energy public transport, the sixth systemic alternative. And this is especially important in our South African context where the lack of well-functioning, safe, affordable passenger and non-passenger transportation is a uniquely frustrating and unjust experience. This lack of safe and accessible transportation is a result of things such as apartheid spatial planning and related systemic inequalities, the failure and crisis state of public institutions, the car and road-centric cultures that have met the needs of wealthy individuals and industries, but created largely unsafe and unhealthy and unfair transportation systems for the majority. And so the goal of the campaign is to accelerate the deep just transition by rejecting the continued reliance on fossil fuels and car-centric planning in favor of passenger and non-passenger mobility approaches that are centered on eco-mobility and clean energy public transport. And so, in today's webinar and at the start of this series, we will explore eco-mobility, more specifically how walking and cycling cultures can be built and sustained in South Africa. How do we break from these car-centric cultures that benefit a few? And as populations continue to grow and as more and more people are moving to urban areas, how do we decouple transport emissions from growing populations? And overall, how do we transform our communities? We have a really, really incredible panel that has joined us today, and that will help us further unpack this topic. And so how this webinar will be structured is that each of the panelists will have 15 minutes to present and share on their topic. And then once they have all presented, we'll open up the floor for questions and engagement. And so without further ado, it's my privilege to welcome our first speaker, Gordon Laing. He is a registered professional civil engineer with an MBA and BCom, a fellow of the Institute of Directors, Southern Africa, and a recipient of the South Africa Institute of Civil Engineers Transport Division's Chairman's Award in 2023 for his work in sustainable transport. Gordon consults on and advocates for sustainability strategies and approaches with a focus on sustainable transport and social impact. His work stems from the understanding that there's only one planet that can support us, and so a systemic approach to the current polycrisis facing humanity is essential. He also understands that walking and cycling are key to providing affordable access to opportunity. And Gordon serves on the Bicycle Empowerment Network's board and the Pedal Power Association's Exco to help reinforce this. Gordon, the floor is yours. I will stop sharing and you can share your screen.
Hi, everybody. And just while I'm loading, thanks, Jessica. It's quite an introduction, and I think it's a massively important conversation that we're going into. And in some ways, my presentation is not solely focused on walking and cycling, but how we get there at many levels. I'm just wondering, can people see my screen?
Yes.
Great. And it is in presentation mode, I'm assuming, from that side.
Yes.
Great. Very quickly, I will go through some of the slides very, very quickly. In fact, this is probably a 2-day conversation rather than just an afternoon conversation. So we'll head through the slides quite quickly and then just leave space for the others and comments and questions afterwards. But very briefly, I'm just going to touch on inequitable access, the case for active travel, changing the paradigm, and improving the quality of walking and cycling, and then just a very quick conclusion. I think everybody in South Africa is aware of the cost of inequality, and this slide just really shows that we are, depending on how you look at the top or the bottom of the inequality list, but we're among the world's most unequal countries. And the impact of that inequity limits social progress and economic potential and drives high unemployment and crime. So the social ills are a reflection of the inequity that we have. And our transport systems and availability reflects and reinforce the deep inequality, both limiting access and opportunity for a vast majority of our population. This is often, the conversation often doesn't go to car centricity. Jessica touched on it. And this slide is based on some work done in Catalonia, who were trying to create a shift many years ago and realized that they had a problem in doing so. But really, what we're trying to do is reduce the attractiveness of cars. And Catalonia, we're looking at parking regulation and fees, access restrictions, low emission zones, that sort of thing. And it really had a twofold effect that they were trying to achieve, was the reallocation of road space towards active and shared modes, and communications campaigns on the benefits of sustainable modes. The problem that they had was that it wasn't working. And then they realized that the gap between private motor vehicles and sustainable modes was primarily one of perception. And it was their communications and awareness raising programs that contributed to that issue. And really what they were trying to do was improve public transport, invest in high quality infrastructure for pedestrians, micromobility and cycling, cycling parking facilities to foster bike and rides, and create private sector partnerships for micromobility services, drive the move towards dedicated bus lanes, and then a fair and ticket integration system across public transport and micromobility services, and then financial incentives to active modes and micromobility. And it was the gap between what they were trying to achieve and where they were was the inability or lack of focus on the communication and awareness raising that they recognized was so desperately needed. And if we think about it in a South African context, that attractiveness gap is really driven by a car-centric mindset. More lanes, gated communities, and malls reinforce car dependence. The traffic impact assessment, TIA, is an abbreviation for traffic impact assessment, which really looks at prioritizing vehicle flows rather than considering walking, cycling, and public transport as a key mode of travel. So this is one of the issues that we have. And the other issue with TIAs is that they're often very, very locally focused rather than looking at the overall context that they should be considering. The social aspirations driven by a very strong lobby industry that car ownership is a reflection of status. The issues around the vulnerable road users with safety and behavior issues deter walking and cycling, and often it's an unheard voice in the dialogue around what should be happening. And this is dominated by the road space bias, where cars dominate, And the sustainable modes are actually badly affected by this dominance of the car culture and the funding biases that really still favor roads over people-focused accessibility for all. What is really interesting is that there's just a paper has just come out speaking to exactly this, and I'll put it in the link later on, Jessica, just by from Stellenbosch University, which talks to the how road funding is actually skewing the investment in other possibilities, not just transport and travel. There's a really interesting book that came out at the beginning of last year, the result of car centricity, called Killed by a Traffic Engineer, how our paradigms really shape how road systems are designed, where cities are built for traffic and not people, drives the whole sprawl and longer daily travel. But the unsafe streets are blamed on human error. You know, we use the terminology accident, which implies no blame. But really, road design is often a significant contributor to how fast people drive, how dangerously people drive, and the perception that they're entitled to do so. The effects of this are the longer commutes, poorer health outcomes, and the outdated standards and perspectives that are delaying change. We really do need to get into a deep paradigm shift from where we are to how we then shift into a far more sustainable way of accessing opportunity. Very interesting in South Africa was a study done, in fact, it's now three years ago, that there was a 2-year study arising from a panel appointed by the president, where considering how badly the economy was performing. And there were two broad classes of problems that were undermining inclusive growth: the state capacity issue, and then spatial exclusion, which is really what we're talking to at the moment, how people were excluded from economic opportunity and potential by spatial patterns, and how transport planning has actually just reinforced that. And the proposed inclusion solutions included regulating and planning reform, coupled with government spending to create more compact, inclusive cities, moving funding away from catering for motor vehicles towards a far more compact urban form. The book is, or the report is reflected in there, and again, I'll provide a link to Jessica later on for that. That then brings us to changing the conversation from what is known as mobility, the ability to move, to providing access for all. If you think about our cities, Johannesburg, more than or almost half the population faces limited access. Cape Town, it's 40% that face congestion, sprawl, and lost opportunity. And as per the Growth Lab report, improving access is absolutely essential to addressing both the environmental quality and social equity, basically. And this declining access in growing cities is really due to a confluence of a number of things, but the rapid urbanization and motorization trends, the motor normative kind of thinking, which means that jobs, services, and social connections are harder to reach. And it affects both, in fact, low-income communities across cities and low to middle-income suburban residents on long, congested commutes. And also the underserved, the people facing limited opportunities due to poor location or transport options. And we just got to think about it. Very good course that speaks to this, and that link is in the presentation, which we will share later on. And we think about the everyday commuter's reality, and I'm not talking about the people stuck in traffic and cars, but the NMT users are still at massively high risk in the South African context, exposed for longer periods of time because of the longer distances that they've got to walk or cycle. And women and children in particular face frightening and violent everyday situations that constrain their mobility and their ability to access opportunity. It's not only about infrastructure. The Barcelona, Catalonia experience has taught us that. It's about creating safe and inviting cities to walk and cycle, and how that requires addressing the broader societal issues. We've really got to think about urban form, where and how we build opportunity, how we link residential areas to opportunities, and how we integrate all of that. And again, there's a very interesting piece that speaks to that that's in the presentation. In many ways, this speaks to, I don't know how many people are aware of Kate Raworth and the donut economics model. What she has done is really spoken to two things: the ecological ceiling. We've got 9 planetary boundaries in terms of the ecological issues that are facing us. The real tragedy is that we've already transgressed 6 of those boundaries, and I think everybody is aware of what's been happening with the climate issues facing the country, but there are 8 other issues that are really facing us at many levels. I'm not going to go into those in any detail. The link to the discussion is below. But then she spoke about a social foundation above which there was really the safe and just space for humanity. And, in South Africa, almost 40% of our population is at or below that social foundation. And it's based on 12 internationally agreed minimum standards. And the space in between, the donut, that sweet part of that pastry that we all like so much, is where humanity can thrive. And that's the socially just and environmentally safe space for us to thrive. And this has been adopted by many cities around the world. I think Amsterdam was the first. C40 cities and thriving cities have now adopted this as their departure point for much of their planning. This speaks to the Sustainable Development Goals, which certain people are now disavowing, which is a real tragedy. But in many ways, although not mentioned in the Sustainable Development Goals directly, transport is key to actually achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, reduced emissions, improving equity, reducing poverty, and building inclusive economies and settlements, as well as addressing the environmental issues that are facing us. And it's essential to achieving most, if not all, of the SDGs and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. It really is critical in all of we're trying to achieve. And again, there's a link in the presentation to go and interrogate that more. So the question becomes, what is sustainable transport and how do we do it? But it's effective, efficient, resilient, and it minimizes environmental impact. It's safe, accessible, and affordable for all. It advances economic and social development. It fosters social interaction and encourages inclusiveness. And it contributes directly to poverty alleviation and reducing inequality. So then, for the purposes of the later part of this conversation, how do we shift? And the key here is shifting from car-centric approaches to people-centric approaches in our cities. So we have to, and that's what we're talking about this afternoon. We have to prioritize sustainable modes. Walking, cycling, and public transport must be made universally accessible. We really have to challenge car-centrism and overcome the motor normative thinking and auto-dominated culture. And there's a massive, massive body that is trying to reinforce that rather than actually addressing that. The green transport conversation is in many ways reinforcing this conversation, basically, because what that is about is selling more motor vehicles, not really changing the way we travel and access opportunity. It's about equitable funding. It's allocating budgets to drive the transformation that is required. It's about redesigning planning processes, and we've touched on that, but we really have to integrate accessibility, sustainability, and equity from the start. One of the key things that we must do is address the way TIAs are done at the moment, and we have to transform our urban form, creating compact, connected, mixed-use, and livable spaces. The case for NMT, I think everybody is aware of that, the space taken up by private motor vehicles versus public transport versus walking and cycling. And also the energy efficiency is a key part of that conversation. And it's really interesting to see how a bicycle and walking are so much more efficient than just an electric vehicle, and even more efficient than a petrol-driven or a diesel-driven vehicle. But what is really interesting is how travel speeds converge in urban cores. And these are time distance travel footprints for cycling, where traveling to or from the CBD node in the AM or the morning or afternoon peak periods is quicker by bicycle over general traffic. And this is Joburg, Sandton, Cape Town, and Pretoria. And you can see that the distances range between 15 and 10 kilometers, where it's quicker to travel by bike than to travel by car. How do we go there? How do we achieve that? And how do we go there? So the key question then really, or key questions are, how can we retrofit existing systems to achieve equitable access? And how can we embed equitable access in all new projects? And those are really the two departure points that we should do for any urban and transport planning project. And there's a very useful framework that speaks to us. So we've got to look at what is available. The services must exist where they're needed. It's got to be accessible so everybody can reach them. It's got to be affordable so that costs are not a barrier. And the affordability speaks both to the affordability from the fiscus and to the individual. And it's got to be acceptable. It's got to be safe, comfortable, easily accessed, and user-friendly for all. And that really gives us the 4 A's for that framework for equitable access. There is a table that speaks to this in some detail, but I'm not going to go into each of those. And I think anybody who gets the presentation can just go through it and interrogate these in detail. But but each of there are a set of key questions that we can ask as we're doing that assessment framework, and to see how well the project or program is actually achieving sustainable access to opportunity. And I really think that when looking at the questions, you should also consider for whom, and the for whom means for whom it is safe, who might feel less safe, and who can afford the service and who can't. So then really take that approach to looking at how we serve our broader communities. And we've got to look at it as an integrative approach, considering a wide range of characteristics and how they impact on one another. So planning things in isolation or in a silo really just locks in all sorts of unintended consequences at many levels. And then also just think about how our own experiences and where we live and how we've grown up affects our judgment. How do we put ourselves in the shoes of the mom who is taking her daughter to school by public transport from a township where there's very low power and in terms of lighting and that sort of thing? So walking from door to public transport access, public transport to the school, and then back home afterwards. And how can the daughter travel back home if mom is still at work? And what does that look like? That's one of the examples that we continually use. And then also just ask people what they want and how that could work for them. Really interrogate in terms of stakeholder engagement what that could actually look like. And how do we enable thinking out of the box? There's a really useful integration of land use and transport approach called the Triple Access Framework, which speaks to three things: the proximity of opportunity, and the opportunity in terms of where people live and work, how transport actually provides the mobility needed to get to opportunity, and how accessible that transport is, and then digital access. So that's the triple access approach. How do we retrofit CBDs? And Cape Town, as an example, is now looking at a new CBD plan to see how we can start doing that in Cape Town. So it's really how do we start doing that? And Josie, my Josie, is doing a lot of good work in that space, and the young urbanists are a key part of taking that forward. And it moves beyond just infrastructure. It's personal behavior change and attitude. And we've got to be careful of impatience, because if we're impatient, we may do things that actually lock us into something that is actually not suited for the longer term. Got to think about mobility hubs and how we start creating hubs that serve the community in all sorts of ways as part of a new urban framework. Got to move away from gated communities, so create permeability. And a key example here is Colorado, which have now legislated that they will not expand highways unless absolutely essential. But every project has to be assessed on the basis of how it's contributing to sustainable access to opportunity rather than enabling additional car travel. And what this does, this speaks to the spatial interventions in 15-minute neighborhoods. I think many people are aware of what Paris has done since COVID with the 15-minute city under Anne Hidalgo. But really, it's around four main principles designed to interrelate and reinforce each other. Complete neighborhoods, integrated neighborhoods where opportunity and residents are really in close proximity and accessibility. They're places for everyone. The streets are people-centered in terms of where people can move and walk and cycle easily, and the mobility is also people-centered, so it becomes universally accessible. And I know this is controversial, but we've really got to think very carefully about universal accessibility. It is a long-term goal, but we need to think about the implications of driving universal accessibility at every level, and how we may be disadvantaging a much broader section of society. So it's got to be a balanced approach. And it's about connected places. It really is about a set of policy actions that provide residents access to most, if not all, of their needs, including access to public transport within a short walk or bike ride from home. So a 15-minute city is not a city where everything is available within 15 minutes. It's a city that is composed of precincts that are 50-minute precincts, basically. What does success look like? And here we come back to the four in the quadrants earlier on: complete neighborhoods, they're compact and mixed use; active travel and local services and transport infrastructure; proximity and decentralization of the city life and services, so it's moving business opportunities to where people live as well; activation of ground floors; and adaptable spaces. So we avoid single-use spaces as much as possible. It's places for everybody. They're socially inclusive, active community engagement, driving or developing cohesive communities, and it's equitable. It's about being connected. It's physical, digital, and digitalized utilities and services. And it's primarily people-centric. The streets and mobility are all about people. Walking and cycling is a mode of choice. City spaces are reclaimed from the private motor vehicles. And it's about tactical urbanism and temporary activation driving the conversation and greening public spaces so people can use them. This speaks to what is recognized in the International Panel for Climate Change, the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, the ASI approach, the Avoid, Shift, and Improve approach, and brought into this is a thing called Enable. But really what the approach is talking about is avoiding the need to travel, shifting to less carbon-intensive modes, and then improving vehicle design, performance, and energy efficiency. And one of the dangers of this is the green transport conversation. Green transport is really looking to improve the technology that people are using. It's not addressing the congestion issues and the urban form issues. So travel demand management really speaks to the avoid and shift aspects. And then key in all of this, and the Growth Lab report recognizes that, and I think many people in the conversation will realize that we haven't delivered on what are reasonably good policies and strategies. It's the enablement of government and society to deliver on these. So this is what is now termed the EASY framework. And we really have to look at sound, effective, and responsible governance systems which are adequately resourced, capacitated, and financed. And the other thing is that often we speak about the financing of projects. What we really need to do in every single project or program that we're looking at is allocate a significant amount of the money to behavior change. All too often, that's a very low part of the budget, but that's key in everything that we're trying to do. And then the bottom little 4 circles that are there is really just a very quick pictographic of the triple access framework, which is a very useful framework to support the easy approach. We've got to redesign our planning process to be able to achieve this. We've got to look at mode segregation. We've got to prioritize active mobility and public transport, improving its safety and comfort to make it universally accessible over the private motor vehicle. We have to support walking as a key mode. We can't talk about cycling in one conversation and not consider walking on the other side. And many people speak to, as an example, to the Netherlands, and I've been accused of not being correct in this, but the Netherlands, the Stop Kindermoord conversation, it enabled cycling, but it wasn't about cycling. It was stopping the death of children on the roads. And that really led to a whole rethink about how the Netherlands cities were redesigned, which then allowed cycling to become a key mode of transport. But primarily it was about changing urban form to enable walking and cycling as a means of access and changing the way people traveled at so many levels. And we've got to think about it in terms of slower spaces, better places. And it's about social interaction, the quality of life and health for all. It's about improving walkability. Interestingly, the term walkability didn't exist 20 years ago. And we made walking so unnatural that we had to invent a word to describe what we were missing. And that's a fascinating observation, that. But it's addressing safety and security. Users must feel safe when using public spaces and transport services, no matter the location or time of day. We've got to serve desire lines. We need to look at where people would naturally move from where they live to where they want to be and how we serve that. And it's, we have motorways in Cape Town, for instance, 4-lane carriageways where there are thousands of people crossing mid-block because that's their desire line. We've got to change the motorway, not drive people to move where the level crossings are or controlled crossings are. We've got to go to high maintenance standard in terms of NMT facilities, high quality access for NMT users. We've got to reduce vehicle speeds. And I know the national government is talking about a 30-kilometer-an-hour speed limit in suburban areas. Really must drive that conversation. Traffic calming measures, better lighting and CCTV coverage. In many ways, that speaks to addressing what is identified in the Kill by a Traffic Engineer book. And we've got to improve and really make crossings universally accessible and improve visibility so that anybody can walk anywhere, anytime. Building on that, we've got to focus on improving walking and cycling facilities. We've got to foster social interaction and inclusiveness, scholar transport through walking and cycling programs, and we've really got to shift the thinking. We've got to create the opportunity for scholars to move relatively easily from where they live to where they go to school. Bike buses are an example of that, but the infrastructure and systems need to support those, basically. We need to require all new developments to incorporate walking and cycling as a direct departure point for the solutions. We have to incorporate violence reduction as a critical transport policy goal. And we've got to decouple NMT to focus on the different needs of pedestrians and cyclists. We shouldn't be talking about an NMT strategy. We should be talking about separate walking and cycling plans and strategies. We've got to tailor these solutions to local contexts and plan with the community. Got to visit the sites, walk or cycle the routes. We can't have a young engineer designing a cycling facility who A, has never ridden a bike, B, has never actually gone and walked the route, so that all the accesses to houses, the intercom buttons at the accesses to houses get taken out by the cycle facility, because that's what the line says on a plan. Need to know that they're there and then arrange to do that shift properly. We've got to embrace new uses and technologies. Think about the cargo bikes, the e-bikes, pedelecs, how they're starting to really come into their own, and how do we cater for them? What do we need to change in terms of our design standards there, and how that affects the last mile collections and deliveries? And really, I think it's a very quick overview from my side, but in conclusion, many policies and plans support walking and cycling, but are not given due support themselves. So they're not high on the list. Many young engineers don't even know how to design a cycling or a walking facility as part of a cross-section of a road. So we really got to look at all of that. We require a paradigm shift. It can't be business as usual anymore. We need to be courageous about it, and we need both the political and the officials to step into that space. And walking and cycling have to be front and center in all transport planning and also all development planning as well. So decision makers have a choice. The transport sector can continue to be part of the problem, or it can change course and lead the solution. And really, my question to everybody is, what are we waiting for, or what are you waiting for in the space, and how do we go about changing it? And there's a very interesting piece on that given or prepared by Slowcat, From Turbulence to Transformation, Navigating Challenges Towards Action on Transport and Climate and Sustainability. Thanks very much, everybody. There's a list of references at the end, and that's me.
Thank you so much, Gordon. I think that was a great start for us, and really sort of gave us the broad overview that we need. So yeah, I really appreciate that, and looking forward to hearing all of your engagements with that. But yeah, I'm excited to introduce our next speaker. I think yeah, her talk will sort of give us a bit of the practical working out of some of these ideas. Next up, I'm privileged to welcome and introduce you all to Marcela Guerrero Casas. I hope I pronounced that correctly.
Perfectly.
Marcela is the co-founder of Local South, a social enterprise dedicated to advancing local action in the global south to create sustainable, dynamic, and livable cities. Born and raised in Bogota, Colombia, Marcela spent much of her adult life in the United States before relocating to South Africa. She moved to Johannesburg in 2006, working across Zimbabwe, Eswatini, Kenya, before settling in Cape Town in 2011. There, she founded Open Streets, an NGO committed to transforming streets into inclusive public spaces, fostering community engagement across Cape Town. Marcela holds a master's in public administration and international affairs from Syracuse University and has over a decade of experience in policy and advocacy. Thank you so much for joining us, Marcela.
Thank you, Jessica, and hello, everybody. So just to underscore that, my partner and I started Local South because very often the references are the global north of what can be achieved with very large budgets, and oftentimes in contexts that are not necessarily relevant. Nothing wrong with looking, for really kind of 5-star bicycle lanes and things like that. But I think if we're going to implement a lot of the stuff, we need to be quite real about what's possible. By the way, Gordon, there are people in South Africa talking about co-sister economics. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but just to say that there's a group that's kind of taking those principles of the donut economics to adapt it here. But I want to talk to you today about Open Streets. That was the request from Jessica and the team. And I thought that I would start by showing you a very short clip Also, maybe to say for those of you who don't know much about Colombia, the clip is about the original open streets that started 50 years ago. It's also a very unequal country, as you may have seen on that graph that Gordon showed us. So there's something very relevant, I think, for the South African context. So I'm going to share this video. It's going to be just over a minute. I hope you can hear. Here we go.
Every Sunday, a miracle.
Marcela, I'm not sure if it's just me, but I think the video has frozen.
I think it has.
Yeah, correct.
Jessica, it looks as though we might have lost Marcela. I'll get hold of her on the WhatsApp quick.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Were you not able to hear any of that?
Yes, I just wanted to say it paused and yeah, froze for a bit. I'm also happy to
Okay.
share from my side if you'd like.
Were you not able to see anything at all? Because if you just got a little bit of the feel, that's probably sufficient as an icebreaker.
On my side, it was completely frozen. Yeah.
All right. Would you like to share from your side then, Jessica?
Yeah, I'm happy to quickly do
Thank you.
that.
Every Sunday, a miracle happens in the otherwise permanently gridlocked streets of Bogota, when a million cyclists, roller skaters and runners take over more than 100 kilometers of roads. This 50-year-old initiative has become one of the most loved and recognizable traditions in the Colombian capital, one that unites people from all walks of life in imagining a more livable city.
Para nosotros, desde que
As far back as I can remember, we've been participating in the ciclovia. When our son was born, we'd come with him in a stroller, and now he's one of the volunteers helping to run it.
When it first started, it covered just 5 kilometers, but today it runs throughout most of this sprawling city of 9 million, requiring the work of an army of volunteers and city employees. A free and public effort sustained over decades that has put Bogota on the world map for successful green initiatives.
This is one of the few concepts that came from the global south that has flourished, but the best is to see this often violent, chaotic and messy city turn into an oasis of harmony, coexistence and respect.
And authorities say it's also cost-saving. Studies show that every dollar invested in it means $3 saved in health costs for the city.
We can stop there, Jessica. Thank you. And I have posted the link in the chat in case people want to watch the rest. It's not super long, but I thought that I would, rather than, especially for those of you who've heard the story before, rather than hearing me, just to see it in action. Last year, Bogota celebrated 50 years of ciclovia. In the image you see here on the right is a main road on an open streets day, inspired by this concept of ciclovia. I thought that I would just share a little bit about kind of how it came about. For me, it's really powerful, as I said at the beginning, how cities can learn from, cities of the Global South can learn from each other. And it's really heartening that, in 2012, when a group of us got together and started kind of thinking about this idea, Johannesburg had tried it before. It had kind of happened a couple of times. Cape Town had tried it before as well. It was called Car Free Festival, but it hadn't become a program. And definitely not other African city had an open streets initiative of any sort. And we mapped it last year as inspired by the 50-year celebration, and those were some of the cities that we identified. And really, I thought I would tell you about just 3 of those cities and kind of the way it works in those places. And I'm going to jump ahead and start by telling you about Mitchell's Plain, and then I'm going to reverse back. But I don't know how many people in the call are based in Cape Town. So I will assume that not everybody is, but I feel like Mitchell's Plain really illustrates the power of what OpenStreet aims to do. Gordon has really highlighted how complex the issue of, creating a city that's pedestrian friendly, that prioritizes walking and cycling, because obviously it's not just about that. It's really about thinking about that big sort of system that he so eloquently described for us. But there's something about the once-off opportunities that we have. And that, to me, was the power of OpenStreet. So even though I grew up in a city where OpenStreet was happening every Sunday, I never thought of it as anything special. It just happened, 100 kilometers, no big deal, right? Well, when we got together, a group of us, as I said, in 2012, and started thinking, could we replicate something that's similar? It was a different story. So, telling or asking for permission to shut down streets, particularly if it's a long stretch. In Mitchell's Plain, we were doing 1.5 kilometers, which again is, not very long, but it's long enough that it sort of triggers lots of permit requirements and costs also associated with putting on an event. And even though the cost was high, the model wasn't really so sustainable in the long term, we were able to create something that was quite special. And for me, Mitchell's Plain was really kind of iconic because this was a street that normally people would be afraid to be on. I mean, even in a car, let alone cycling or walking, and just for a number of hours on a Sunday, because so many people came, both from Mitchell's Plain, but also from other parts of Cape Town. And there was a reason to be there. That sense of safety enabled this, what back in the day, I used to call it magic, and, in a very kind of romantic way. And I still think it's magic. It's the kind of magic that isn't sustained or sustainable the way that it has happened in other places in Latin America. But I feel like it provided some images and some feelings that then evolved into things, and Roland will speak about what they're doing now around open streets, different formats, different model, but in many ways inspired in what happened in places like Mitchell's Plain. It is happening in other parts of Africa, as I said, and I just thought I would mention 2 more examples. So one is Addis Ababa. And to me, the story is also really interesting because for those of you who've been there, you'll remember or recognize that this is not the typical image of Addis on a regular day. Traffic is quite hectic. And even though most people walk, it is very car-centric, not unlike South African cities. But this started in 2018, and I'm proud to say that we brought together a couple of people from Addis for an open streets exchange in Cape Town in 2018. And it happened that one was a government official in the transport department, and another person was more of an activist from civil society who, had spent time in Latin America, really liked the concept. And they had a conversation that, they hadn't had a chance to have in Addis, and went back and started this program, which continues today. Very different model. So it happens once a month. It happens in 23 different sites of the city, and this distances vary. So, a different way kind of thinking about it. I'm going to show a very short clip now about Kigali in Rwanda, and just let me know if the sound doesn't work, then we'll move forward.
Did you know that Rwanda's journey to sports in the streets began in 2016. It all started with Kigali's car-free zone, later named Imbuga City Walk. This is where we are. The community loved it very much. It quickly became a hub for sports and recreation. It is this passion to sports in open spaces that gave rise to Kigali's Car-Free Day. The Car-Free Day in Kigali is when the major roads close to cars and open up for activities like running, jogging, cycling, doing road tennis, and so much more. We come together and we do sports together. What began as once a month event has now become a twice a month one. We do it in all the three districts of Kigali, Nyarugenge, Kicukiro, and Gasabo. We don't only do sports in the streets, but we have also created the running tracks. We now have 2 running tracks in Kigali, Nyarutarama and Kimihurura. As Bogota celebrates 50 years of Scrovia.
So this, as you can see, was a video
the original
we put together for the 50th anniversary. But let's go back to, yeah. So this is the kind of 3 examples I wanted to share with you. I'm going to wrap up with kind of 3 lessons or 3 reflections. And hopefully there's a little bit of time at the end if you guys have any questions. Otherwise, my details are there. You can contact me later. But the first thing is that it's a simple concept. I mean, shutting down the street. I mean, it's difficult to implement, but it's a simple idea that needs to meet realities on the ground. So Bogota is a very dense city. Most Latin American cities are very dense. So shutting down a few blocks means that a lot of people have access to that space. Cape Town doesn't have that, at least not kind of overall the entire city. So really identifying what is required, where the kind of most appropriate space is really critical. I mean, the image here you see is in Harare, and very different sort of context. Sometimes in Harare it happens, I think, once a year. So it doesn't have to necessarily be that regular program, although that's ideal. But in my mind and in my experience, starting where you are matters. Collaboration between government and residents is paramount. Gordon has highlighted the importance of engagement, and I think in these kinds of programs is even more critical, because unless you have buy-in, unless people feel that that there's some value in this, the programs don't continue. And open streets is a means to an end. So it's not about the day, even though, it's a lot of fun. And, every time I go back, I was there in December, and it's just amazing. It is magical to be able to walk and run in a city that normally is polluted, traffic is terrible, et cetera, et cetera. It's not safe, again, very similar to your context here. But it's not about the days. It's really about what it can enable, what happens the rest of the time. In Bogota, the bicycle infrastructure covers a large part of the city. And it's not, Denmark, not Copenhagen, and it's not, US cities or whatever, although US is not a good example. But you know what I mean? It's not, but it's so some of them are imperfect, some of them are not kind of in the best state. Some of them are just fainted, some of them are segregated. So it's a mix. But the bottom line is that lots of people cycle there. And there is a relationship between the kind of weekly activity with the way people behave on a day-to-day basis, not to mention things around public health and many other benefits. I'm going to stop there in case there are questions at the end, and to give Roland an opportunity to go next. But as I said, if there isn't time, my details.
Thank you so much, Marcela, for sharing that. I think it was really inspiring to see those examples. I feel like we can often think these things are happening in silos and maybe we're the only one who's doing this, but it's amazing to see, all over Africa, the examples of this sort of work. So thank you for that. To end us off, I have the privilege of welcoming Roland Postma. Roland is the Managing Director of Young Urbanists South Africa and the co-director of the Active Mobility Forum. He holds a first-class honors in urban and regional planning and also lives in Cape Town. And has just created an incredible platform that encourages and empowers people to become active citizens and change their communities. This has been through advocacy events that have raised awareness around issues around urban planning, sustainability, to undo above-date planning, and to facilitate policy reforms. I've been following Active Mobility Forum and Young Urbanists for a while now, and it's been incredible to see the work that they do. So yeah, Roland, you can go ahead.
Fabulous. Hi everyone. Am I audible? Am I clear?
Yes.
Jessica, how are we doing for time?
Um, we're still good. You've got about 15
I'll,
minutes.
I'll be quick as
Yeah.
soon because I think both Gordon and Marcela have given a very strong foundation around where we need to go, what are the problems, and just to kind of go back to Marcela quickly and Gordon, quite frankly, to complement them. It wasn't for people like Gordon and Marcela, the foundation that what we are doing as Young Urbanists and our many partners, including working with Local South and PPA, that one of the many organizations that Gordon represents, is that we wouldn't have had some of the kind of wins in the last kind of a few years. And of course, exactly what Marcela said is what has happened in the global south. And of course, there's nothing wrong with what's happening in the global north context, but it has to be contextual to whether it's to a global south city or town. Young Urbaners is a non-for-profit. Just introductions, Roland Postma, Afrikaans, the funny accent. So I promise I'm from South Africa. But I do have a funny accent. While I did study urban planning, the big challenge for urban planners is how do we become relevant, really? And so it's always my love to be part of advocacy. And then what Young Urbanist tries to do is empower young people, not just your typical urban planners and architects, but really everyone. So I hope there's a diversity of professionals on this call. And what we're trying to do is bring people together, young people across our cities, predominantly in the Western Cape and Gauteng, but also to show young people and policymakers that actually change can be done. So my presentation is very kind of image driven because we've spoken about walking and cycling and how they're so important. Of course, there's more complex themes: politics, funding, how it integrates with land use, the macro mobility, behavior. Institutional arrangements and so forth, and capacity and collaboration. But the projects that we're going to speak about is about all those things quite quickly. I just want to quickly perhaps go down because we start with open streets. This is a picture. Can you guys see my screen? Just to confirm quickly.
Yes.
Thanks, Jessica. This was actually Open Langa that was organized by the Langa Bicycle Hub and Local South, and we were merely sub partners with others in the community and outside of the community. That shows again the power of open streets. But what we've kind of worked with Open Streets Cape Town, now Open Streets Africa, has always advocated for is how do we do these things that doesn't cost a lot of money, and so. Open Streets, as Marcela was saying, has that power to show a different behavior for people to come together and rethink actually what our roads are for. And I think a very good point is we do not have that density. If we look at a map of Cape Town and most South African cities, our densities are on the periphery. So our CBD that has big built form, big buildings, high skyscrapers, it's actually empty. In fact, about 70% of our housing stock in the CBD is Airbnb or short rental market. So we have an issue between where people are based and, of course, the quality of the services and where they work. And that's, of course, yes, our history, but also failures in the last kind of 30 years in the post-apartheid era. And so we have good policies, I think, that both panelists spoke about, but the problem is implementation. And I think Open Streets is one of those powerful initiatives. Most recently, we've really worked with the mayor's office and different departments, including mobility as well as events, to actually agree, guys, this is not an event. We don't need an event application. And so what we've been doing on Bree Street and most recently in Langa on this street and Lototoli Avenues, we've been able to close down the streets on a weekly and monthly basis to do the Open Streets concept that was started by Marcela and the team, but with the idea of working towards a more frequent basis so that we can work towards everyday urbanism. I think that's the most important point, is how do we make these realities. And Open Street is not a radical, but because this road is normally a road for cars, but it's a radical intervention, and perhaps we can look at something different in the middle that can be more permanent. I mean, Gordon mentioned tactical urbanism, which I'll speak to in a second. In fact, if you could look at that pink what do you call this? A pink let's say, a seating thing, that wooden thing. We used it for part of an experiment, but I'll get to that in a second. So we've done that on Bridge Street Sundays. We did it for 6 months. So every Sunday, which was something I do not recommend for anyone. Doing it every week, every Sunday from 10 to 5. And we're doing the second year edition. We've really demonstrated quite quickly that it's good for business. Cars do not shop, it's people. Most businesses on average has reported a 20% increase in sales. That's both across hospitality and retail. Again, it's very important to get that data. We've installed with the city AI cameras. We can see how more people have come to the street and more of a community is created where people linger longer, children play, people cycle. And that's very important, particularly, Gordon spoke about what all the issues, but what's now happening, there's hopefully a transitional institutional change with especially the new walking and cycling strategy, which we'll speak about in a second. And of course, most recently, the mobility and access to mobility plan for the Cape Town. And please note, Durban and both Johannesburg have similar initiatives, master plans for the CBD that talks about a more pedestrian-focused CBD. The big issue is implementation. So Open Streets allows for that, and for us to be able to do non-events has been able to do that. We're doing lots of Tolly on a monthly basis, and most recently we're working now with Josie My Josie that Gordon mentioned to do Main Street in the center of Marshalltown, the CBD of Johannesburg. And it's very much our hope to institutionalize this, so it's not just young urbanists, but indeed anyone, whether it's a Langa bicycle hub or anyone for that matter, to do a form of open streets on their street without having to spend too much money on being able to do it, so that we can test things out and change minds and actually capture the value so that we can advocate towards permanent change. So as you see, I spoke about that pink little thing. Very illegally and dangerously, not dangerously, but illegally, me and my team, we did 3 street experiments in Langa last year, where for a day we redelineated 3 interventions across Langa, with the idea of putting the power back to pedestrians, particularly scholars, so children. We have a lot of scholars. The economy loses 200 billion rands a year on road crashes. Predominantly, the children between the age of 2 to 14 are being killed on our roads. So there's a big movement of children walking from Langa to Aflo in the surrounding area, and there's no real protection. So we were able to do this experiment. It was very illegal. I do not recommend to do it. But like I've mentioned, open streets is very powerful, but we need to work towards everyday urbanism by what we call street experiments. And that's why we've recently launched Street Experiments South Africa, that really builds on the strong legacy that Open Streets Cape Town has built, where we're doing more open streets experiments on a more frequent basis, non-event basis. But then we really want to work towards everyday basis. And we're currently in partnership with the city of Cape Town as well as the city of Johannesburg to do these everyday street experiments. What I can say is, if you're interested, we just secured some funding from the Dutch Creative Fund to actually make these street experiments permanent, that is compliant with what we call the South African Roads Manual. We'll get to that in a second, because currently, as an example, the things we need to change, and Gordon, I need your help, and Marcela, is that if we want to use planters to delineate a street experiment, there's a liability issue for the traffic engineers that will sign off on that, because if something happens and goes to courts and it's not in the South African manual, then they are liable for that. So we need to change. South Africa has very outdated sometimes and good policies, but they need to be reformed. And of course, those policies that are good needs to be implemented. And I've mentioned we're working towards everyday street experiments, and I'm very happy to report that we've worked with the city of Cape Town to actually deliver and conceptualize the first ever street experiment that looks at dieting a road. Because I think, Marcela, we spoke about this, and you mentioned this to my board, which is so positive, is that way back the Johannesburg Development Agency did the first kind of open street experiment, where also they didn't have a kind of, I think, an event permit. So what we want to do now, the city of Cape Town, in lieu of the CBD mobility plan that looks at really prioritizing streets of people, is to do the first ever street experiment where we removing 2 on-street parking bays, 2 lanes of on-street parking, as well as 2 slow lanes, where we road dieting three city blocks in the heart of Cape Town CBD as a 6-month experiment. Now, the significance here is this experiment is the public participation process. So rather than, because normally we have to wait until 5 years, lots of money for good reasons. Obviously, infrastructure is expensive, but this allows to tactically test it out, get the data, get the public input from local businesses, and then the city can make that permanent or make any changes. And these are the kind of institutional changes we're advocating for. We are privately funding this, so it's very much our hope that the city will start doing this, not just in areas like the CBD, but areas that actually need it, your Dunoons, Kailicha, Langa, and other parts of the city, and the same goes to other municipalities. If all goes well, tomorrow we will have an installation date of mid-March where we're doing this for 6 months to test it out. And depending on what the data says, we'll make this permanent. This is a partnership between us and the city. It's part of another PPP that I'll talk about called Safe Passage, because one of the things that young urbanists have realized is that we actually need to find tools and public-private partnerships to do things, because government might say we support it on principle, but they don't have the funding or priority. So we've really gone out with all our projects and found these partnerships with the private sector to invest. This project will cost around 2 million rands that we are investing, and the idea is to show a model that can be scaled to other parts of the city, and hopefully I can share a installation date with everyone soon. And very interesting, this took the city 7 weeks, mere 7 weeks, the civil engineers to approve this. So the city has shown agility, and we really hope to institutionalize this. It's not just this district, but other areas of the city and other municipalities. I mean, part of walking and cycling that Jessica spoke about is micromobility. One of the other projects is launching. We're launching a national agnostic campaign with Take a Lot Mr. Josie My Josie, Mission for Inner City Cape Town, another PPP, as well as other aggregators like Woolworths, McDonald's, Nando's, to launch a national campaign around upgrading micromobility spaces to make them safer and compliant. We see micromobility part of that as the AMF, the Active Mobility Forum, one of our programs, where we want to work with all the aggregators and all the partners in active mobility, walking, cycling, disabled, and so forth, including micromobility, because this is part of solving congestion, having less cars on roads. And so we want to, again, create agnostic, compliant infrastructure where we bring private sector money to upgrade these spaces. And that's very important. So Young Urbanists is not just an advocacy organization, but we also bringing private sector certainty to government to invest in these spaces that are very hard to tap into. And of course, the idea is to make it agnostic and scalable so that others can also do it. All of this, we want to make the intellectual property to this as open as possible, so that we have both municipalities and the private sector and civil society to be able to do this across not just South Africa, but Africa, as what Marcela spoke about, the Open Streets toolkit. This was just a before, that's an after. But back to walking and cycling, so important. One of the other things we did was our Safe Passage. That's the consortium that's funding the Bridge Street Diet, or the experiment, is that we were able to upgrade Bridge Street, which is a cycling lane in Cape Town. Now, this only meant 40% of the cycling lane that was upgraded. You can see the before and after. But the significance here was we were able to work with the city to update what they call their Storms, Water and Roads Manual to include this type of standards in their own kind of internal kind of design documents. And I'm very pleased to report that the city is now upgrading another cycling lane with the same standards that we pioneered and collaborated with them. Now, Bridge Street is not safer. This was to see what can be done. And now the city is looking at making the whole cycling lane protected. And when hopefully we can also privately fund this. We funded this. This cost about R500,000. And it really showed how we can tactically, per round, per kilometer, upgrade a space rather than adding more roads. That is far more expensive. We can't build expensive cycling lanes. We need to build cheap tactical cycling lanes. And the bigger update, I've mentioned the new walking and cycling strategy. Similar in Johannesburg, they have something called the Complete Streets Framework, is that they are now actually developing a new design guideline that will be the Bible, I've been told, by the civil engineers going forward. So what that means, any new road upgrade will have better designs prioritizing people. Normally, historically, we had the 2017 walking cycling strategy, but there was not a correlation between what the city was procured and designing from a civil engineering road perspective, and that's now changing. Another reforms in the city is we've we've reformed the comprehensive integration transportation planning to induce demand. So in other words, the city now understands if they build more roads for cars, it will merely increase congestion. So there's a lot of reforms that have been due to the advocacy played by PPA, local south, other partners and us. And slowly we're changing that so that we can have a more capacitated and ethical government. And that's the role that we play as young urbanists with our partners. I think just to finish off, is there's one of our members, Dr. Ruth Nelson, wrote a paper about land use integration. We don't have the density. My city, we're spending 10 billion on that, but they don't actually have the density to support that bus rapid transportation system. Is that she looked at 3 scenarios, and funny enough, one of the scenarios that led to the biggest and fastest land use integration was actually if we prioritize cycling. And she looked at 3 scenarios. Currently, it's quite fragmented due to institutional arrangements and politics, funding, and so forth. And then the other scenario she looked at is if we were actually to integrate all those modes, that has been kind of our policy since the late 1990s, or if we just embrace cycling, and cycling was the fastest, more equitable way. So I guess a big challenge is to change behavior. I mean, just today, a truck hit a cyclist, a recreational cyclist, and you should have seen the. Sorry, someone's calling me. You should have seen how people have reacted, commentators that are quite car-centric. And so we really have a cultural issue at hand, and we need to change that and work with people and change behavior, as what Gordon was saying. But it's so important that we continue to support each other in the civil society space. At Young Urbanists, we're open to any collaborations. We're working with the 2 panelists on this call, and it's so important that we work together. We open our IPs and we see how we can make changes, because otherwise we won't win. As simple as that. South Africa has so much opportunity, and if we can redesign, rethink South African cities, we can really pave the way for other African cities, because currently I think they're beating us. So there's a big opportunity, and there's also a big moral obligation, given how the economy is not moving yet. We're losing our children being killed by cars, and of course apartheid spatial planning is still meaning we're not an integrated city. I'll stop there, but I think my last message is that change is possible, change has happened, so we shouldn't just be jaded. And we should continue to be persistent and demanding positive change when it comes to how we manage and design our cities. And so thank you so much, Jessica. I'll stop there. I'll put the link of that paper from Dr. Nelson. Thank you in the chat.
Perfect. Thank you so much. That was so inspiring. It's inspiring to see the work that you're doing and how you're working with organizations, with government to make this happen. Now I'd just love to open up the floor for some questions and engagements. You're welcome to raise your hand and unmute your mic to give a question, or you can just put it in the chat and I'm happy to read it out.
Is that a shell-shocked silence from everybody, or deep thinking
Everyone's still
processes?
taking it in, taking it in. Ralph, you can go ahead.
Quickly unmute. Yes, I just want to know, guys like us who are activists here in the rural areas, are you not focusing maybe on some of the big rural communities like Malmesbury and those Atlantis? Because I see you are only focusing in the metros mostly. So our communities are also, and most of our people, we live in the city where they work and where they operate and do business. So won't it be maybe more fruitful to see it if you start that side also? Thanks.
Thanks, Rolf. Yeah, I don't know if anyone wants to respond.
I can. Yeah, Ralph, I think your very important point, the historical and contemporary focus is our cities. Obviously, as we're rapidly urbanizing our cities, there's a big demand given there's more people living in our cities. But I think the perhaps opportunity is there's also an equal demand in our rural areas. And of course, most people do live and they commute very long distances to these city centers, right? Particularly on the periphery of Cape Town. And I think perhaps to turn that around, the value proposition is that you can actually demonstrate bigger, quicker change and show what can be done. I think, it's almost criminal that in post-apartheid context, we haven't transformed any kind of rural town in terms of, our policies and our vision and our national development plan and our constitution. In terms of us, our focus is always will be currently cities, but when we do add capacity, we really want to look at towns, but we just don't have the capacity as of yet. I'll stop there. And I know that's not a good answer, but that's just the truth. Thank you.
Maybe I can come in as well, Jessica. I think there's, what Roland has said is so valid. And I think one of the other things, so many of the spaces that we work in are metropoles, and the rural towns often fall under the provinces. And certainly for the Western Cape, for argument's sake, I do recommend that you speak to your local politicians and get them to raise with the Western Cape government the bike distribution framework, which is a program that is being run by the Western Cape government to distribute bikes outside of Cape Town to deserving and needy communities. And particular importance there, and the picture behind me, in fact, shows a bike distribution done outside of Cape Town with the Western Cape government in terms of giving scholars bicycles to travel. We've also got to be very careful, is that we must make sure that the routes they can travel on are safe. And that's part of outside of the urban areas or the towns. The province is responsible for those roads. So that's that joint responsibility. But part of the process is to raise the politicians' awareness of the opportunities presented by walking and cycling in safe spaces. So if they can start putting pressure on their bosses, then it makes that whole process easier. And there could well be bikes distributed into some of the towns as well, which would be a start of that process.
Jessica, I also want to add, I mean, it's not exactly, I mean, I think that they've covered it all. Just to share an anecdote, we were approached a couple of years back by Picketberg, which is a small town as well. They were very keen to do open streets, and their kind of motivation was more around creating economic activity, so creating kind of more energy during the weekends. And so just to say that there are kind of different entry points to arrive at the same place. So, it could be about generating more business opportunities. And in that process, you're kind of using your streets in a different way. You're creating safety. So I think all of this contributes to kind of that end goal that we've been discussing around sustainable mobility. So I just wanted to share that. And then the final anecdote, which is very personal, is I grew up in a very small town outside of Bogota. And I remember my mother kind of riding on the back of my mother's bicycle with my sister in the basket in front. And that's how, most people kind of moved around in this very small town. And so, there are other examples, again, outside of in the global south that would also be interesting to look at. Thanks.
Thank you. There's some questions in the chat. I'll maybe ask two, and then either of you can just answer one. So Andrew asks, how can Joburg pedestrians and cyclists leverage the Josie My Jersey initiative to strengthen blueprints? And then another question is, in developing a framework for sustainable urban transport in sub-Saharan Africa, what key constructs should be prioritized? maybe you can start off with the one about Jersey.
So this for Durban, right, Jessica? Jersey?
So yeah, the question is how can Joburg pedestrians and cyclists leverage that
Right.
initiative? Yeah.
So Jersey was started by private sector, Nando's and a few other corporates. So I think if you know a big corporate that's based in Durban, because Nando's is actually based in Johannesburg, in the city of Johannesburg, then that's a start. We also know that the municipality is looking at a development, I think a development company that's independent. They have a lot of independent companies actually, like Johannesburg, to run something for the CBD, because they also have a similar, I think, CBD master plan around making walking and cycling strategy. In fact, they did some street experiments in Arrowtown that I have a look. So there's actually a few initiatives that are there. What I can do is we have a chapter that we're slowly building in Durban. So if you want to join that, I can put the link there. And there's actually some government people, young people in that chapter that can answer these questions of what's happening there. Because the municipality actually has some good things. I mean, they've also worked with Marcela around, I think, Go Durban and doing, open streets, I think, on Florida Road and previously. So there's actually some good appetite in government. And so perhaps the answer is not a Josie Majoshi, but something in government, by the government, for the people. But if you do know a good corporate contact, then that's how you started. And then I can also put you in contact with the team to kind of give the framework. Whereas the Mission for Inner City Cape Town, just to also mention another PPE, they approach council of establishing something that's a bit more independent, but also they have to report back to council and governance and so forth. So you almost have three routes there two routes effectively, but I'm happy to share that information beyond this call. Let me know if I can put you that chapter link there, and you can ask more questions to the people that are actually working in Durban, as opposed to us from Cape Town. Thanks, Jessica.
Thanks. And yeah, Joan, I hope that answers your question. Yeah, the second question there, I'll just repeat it. In developing a framework for sustainable urban transport in sub-Saharan Africa, what key constructs should be prioritized?
Maybe I can come in there, Jessica. I think as with all of these things, it's a deep understanding of what sustainable transport is about and sustainable access to opportunity is about. So that's the first departure point for driving those conversations. The second part of it is to maybe touch base with organizations like ICLEI, or even, I mean, you could touch base with the South African Cities Network, who've got some frameworks there, but it's to check. C40 cities have got some very good documentation. SACN have got some good documentation. ICLEA has good documentation, and then TUMI, which is based is in Addis Ababa, I think. They also have some good guidelines. So it's possibly picking up some of those guidelines. But I think the key is to have a look at the EASY framework, which C40 cities have some very good documentation on that, and use that as a departure point for conversation. But again, each one of these is context specific. And the other part of the transport conversation is the urban planning, the spatial planning, urban planning conversation, and integrating that. Transport on its own will never address the issues that we touched on in terms of urban sprawl and that sort of thing. And often what happens is transport comes in and serves something that is not going to be sustainable. We can move people anywhere and goods anywhere, but that's not necessarily the sustainable solution. So we should be having the conversation right up front.
Thanks for that, Gordon. And Marcela, I'll actually just sort of throw in a question here. You sort of mentioned that your work is based around the South and the local South, I guess. So what would you say are some of those things that make doing this work around sustainable transport in the South different? What is those unique elements about the local South in comparison to the West?
Yeah, look, there are kind of pragmatic things like budget. I mentioned that already. So, we at one point when we were kind of looking at this, we looked at the budget that New York City has, and it's bigger than the South African budget, the country budget. So, we're talking about very different realities from that perspective, a financial perspective. But there's also things like safety, for instance, has been mentioned by all the speakers. One of the things we found, at Open Streets, but in the work that we do at the moment, is that safety kind of makes it or breaks it. So if people won't go out and use the bicycle lanes or the sidewalks, or participate in activities, and there's this a sense of safety, and this doesn't happen overnight. This is where we need to find ways to create that safety. In Cape Town, there's maybe just worth giving a plug to the Women Walk at Midnight initiative, which has a new name now. But basically, a group of women who every month go out at night and walk this different neighborhoods around Cape Town. And no, that's not fixing the infrastructure, and it's not building new sidewalks, but it's creating opportunities, to experience streets safely. And so I feel like those are the kinds of strategies that, might not be so relevant in a city like Copenhagen. Women walk at night just fine. And then the final example I'll give is around informal trade or informality in general. So, kind of embracing that happens, yes, sometimes it's a little bit chaotic. Sometimes it does present real problems. But in general, there's high unemployment in our cities. How do we embrace what entrepreneurs are already doing in a way that kind of builds that bigger ecosystem? So Roland mentioned micromobility. We're also working on a project around micromobility hubs, and it's absolutely right. Unless there's a space for motorcycle drivers to rest, to be able to park, they're going to use the space that is normally dedicated or is meant to be for pedestrians. So I feel like it's this kind of complexity that we in the Global South need to acknowledge is very unique. And again, not to a particular city, but that, just money is not going to solve it, or like a new policy is not necessarily going to solve it. I feel like we need to and can be and are more resourceful in a lot of our cities.
Thank you so much for that. And I just see a comment here from Charles just saying how he appreciates non-motorized forms of transport, but safety is such a big concern, especially in a country like ours where there's a femicide epidemic. So yeah, thank you for that insight. And yeah, maybe just the last question here from Charles again around your thoughts on the South Africa green transport strategy and its obsessive focus on EVs or electric vehicles.
Let me pick that one up, because I was deeply involved in trying to get it changed. And we did get the first draft stopped because it was even more focused on EVs, and they withdrew the first draft and went to a second draft. Currently, the Department of Transport is working on a new draft, and one of the big drivers is to make sure that it goes beyond car-centric or motor normative planning. And one of the big issues is that we're actually, all of us working in the sustainable transport, sustainable access space, are primarily NGOs and NPOs, and we're underfunded. Not forgetting that part of that conversation is driven by a massively well-funded lobby group called the motor industry and the construction industry and the car industry. So that's who we're fighting against to get the conversation changed. It's not that DOT is not open to that conversation, but we really all have to step up into that space. So when the document comes out for comment, when the new strategy comes out for comment, we all need to really, really push that hard. It's a lot of the work that some of us are doing with the President's Climate Commission and that sort of thing, is to change, not stop the narrative around green, but broaden the conversation to the other aspects of sustainable access to opportunity. And just touching on that, the IPCC report identifies that the green conversation may be only 40% of the carbon reduction that is available. The avoid and shift will give us up to 60% of the reduction of carbon that is so necessary at the moment. So key in that conversation is the enabling, so getting officials to understand that it's going beyond the green conversation, the green economy conversation, to the sustainable economy conversation. And that is the real danger of the interchangeability and the capture of terms by business. And you know, it's something that we've got to be really quite particular about, because it's so easy to just dilute the effectiveness of a term. So green did mean that it was ecological and all that sort of thing, but then it got captured by business, and that's really how business does what it does. So we've really got to think about that very strongly, and we all need to step into that space to comment on the strategy when it comes out. And every conversation we have should actually say, guys, go beyond green to addressing car centricity. Basically, that's really the critical thing. And you know, it's the small things we say without thinking quite often. And one of the things that we all I was guilty of it until somebody pointed out to me, using the term ecosystem when it's not an ecosystem. An ecosystem means that it's a natural system. We're talking about human constructs, which are human-made systems or technological systems. And we've got to be very careful and really think about how we use terminology in the change space that we're trying to work in, because we're either reinforcing a bad message or watering down a good message by the way we talk at many levels.
Thank you so much for that. I think just before we end off, I see someone else has just posed another question, and I think it might be useful, sort of creeping into public transport. But the question is, how is the taxi industry responding to this? So if anyone can share some quick comments, yeah, that'll be maybe.
I mean, this is going to be very controversial. I mean, there's initiatives that's happening around electrical minibus taxis, and currently, because of and Gordon will know this, where our electricity comes from, which is coal predominantly, means there's actually a very minor difference between the impact. But the impact that we're emphasizing is the spatial impact that cars and vehicles have. But in the case of the minibus taxi industry, they are assisting with getting less cars on the road, right? And for most South Africans, without them, they just can't get where they need to be. But the taxi industry needs to be, they need, obviously government. So what government is doing now is that they're relooking at their funding to bus rapid transportation systems, so your BRTs that you have, My City and so forth, and they're looking at sponsoring and subsidizing the minibus taxi industry. But with that, there has to become regulation. Minibus taxis need to adhere to the road rules. They need to pay tax. They need to comply to labor laws. So there's a more complicated conversation that needs to happen, but they need support. And of course, some people fundamentally agree they don't need support or subsidy, but I think they do need subsidy given their important role. But with that, there needs to be conditions to adhere to all the laws that we all as South Africans need to adhere by, which is tax, labor laws, as well as complying to the National Traffic Service Act. Now, of course, we understand why that's happening, because of that very complex behavior and relationship between driver and a kind of spatial makeup. So it's a very complicated, sensitive conversation, and they have a powerful position or a future opportunity to be part of this kind of decarbonization, spatially, and getting less people out of cars. But it's a very complex thing, and I don't think anyone on this call or anyone in government has an answer to that. But there's a lot of things that are now looking both nationally and locally around these things, and it's important that as civil society that we hold everyone accountable, including government as well as the minibus taxi associations. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, we've reached the end of today's webinar, and we won't be taking any more questions. But yeah, there are a whole bunch of resources that have been put in the chat. So I encourage you to go read the articles, to have a look at each of the organizations, and yeah, stay plugged in. And again, thank you to our panelists for sharing your incredible insights today. Yeah, if I was in person, I would say we should give you all a round of applause. And yeah, thank you all for joining in on this discussion. I think, yeah, these discussions are so important as we're thinking about how we can, yeah, transform our societies for better. And as mentioned, this is the first in a series of webinars we'll be hosting to further explore this topic of eco-mobility and clean energy public transport. So please do look out for the details of our next webinar. We'll be focusing a bit more on cycling, and we'll eventually dive more into clean energy public transport. But yeah, if you'd like to be involved or just keep up to date with what's happening, please do reach out, join the Climate Justice Charter movement, and follow us on our social media platforms. I also encourage you to get involved in the work that our speakers are doing at Young Urbanists, at Local South. I think Roland said this, it's important for us to not go alone, but to go together. So please do get involved. With that being said, thank you all so much for joining and for engaging. And I look forward to seeing you all again and hearing some updates from the incredible work that you're doing. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. And thanks, Jessica, for facilitating so well.
Agree with Gordon.